So I just want to introduce Catherine Huitson. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Catherine Huitson. I'm a postdoc at the University of Colorado. I'm working with Professor Jean-Michel Desert on a survey program to characterize exoplanet atmospheres from the ground. So we're using transmission spectroscopy, where we search for the dominant atmospheric absorbers as the planet passes in front of the host star. So our aim is to measure the planet composition, which we do by measuring the dominant atmospheric absorbers in transmission, and we're aiming for low resolution coverage, so we can cover a large wavelength range and measure the dominant absorbers. We also want to sample across the mass radius diagram because we want to get some insight into the underlying physical properties and link them to the observed characteristics in the atmosphere. We decided to observe 9 planets. This was decided 4 years ago, and so we chose a sample that covered the mass radius diagram, but also with low densities and so large atmospheric signals in transit. We also selected stars with bright magnitudes and with ideal comparison stars in field of view. We decided to choose a 9-planet survey rather than studying planets on their own in order to do a comparative study. And also this way we get a large sample which allows us to understand our systematic noise sources better. So we have a long duration survey of 3 years which allows us to observe each planet several times to improve the signal to noise and also understand systematic noise sources, which is a unique approach of our survey. So we now have 29 transits over 193 hours of telescope time, so this was the first survey of its type, and it's also still one of the largest. So there are several ways to do a survey like this, and previous exoplanet atmosphere studies have been done using HST. So this is a transit of one of our targets, but observed with HST. And so you can see that there's a high precision in each data point, but that there are gaps due to the Earth occultation as the Earth passes between the HST and the target. So we decided to observe from the ground in order to obtain continuous time coverage. So that gives us better constraints on the transit parameters like limb darkening, which affect the transit shape and therefore the measured transit depths. And it's also cheaper and easier to go back to observe each target several times. So here is a transit of the same target in the same bandpass. This is HAP P1b of Jupiter, but observed with our survey with GMOS. And you can see we reach similar precisions to the HST, but we have the continuous time coverage. So we're using the Gemini telescopes, which have several advantages as well as being ground-based. So firstly, they have multi-object spectrography capability. So this is a technique that our team first used to observe exoplanet atmospheres, so it's something that we did first, and we have a lot of knowledge about this. Also, we have full sky coverage, so we have the Gemini 8-meter telescopes, one in Hawaii and one in Chile, so we can cover the whole sky. And we're using the Gemini Multi-Object Spectrometers, or GMOS. And these are on both telescopes, so we can cover our whole target list with instruments that were designed the same way. We also have a large enough field of view to get good comparison stars for our bright targets. And we have queue scheduling, which means that we submit a list of transit dates and times along with observing conditions that we want. And then these are executed until we reach the required number of transits that we need. So we don't have to worry about losing specific nights due to weather, and that's really helped us obtain the number of transits that we need for our precision levels. So I just want to briefly go through the technique. We're doing multi-object spectroscopy. So we have 2 stars, a target star and a comparison star. And these are aligned in wavelength, so the vertical lines, as you can see, the vertical lines are sky features. And so this allows us to correct common systematics wavelength by wavelength. We also use a wide 10 arcsecond slit to reduce slit losses, and which improves our precision, because we need 10 to the minus 4 level precision in 10 nanometer spectral bands. So that comes at the expense of some spectral resolution. We then obtain a frame like this that I show you every 50 seconds or so for 5 or 6 hours, which allows us to build transit light curves. So this is an example of transit light curve in the blue optical and one in the red optical, and so each data point you see here is a frame of these 2 stars. So we correct each data point. And you can see we reach a high enough precision, you can see a difference between the transit depth and limb darkening between these 2 bands. So we then split the light further into smaller wavelength bins. So here's an example of transit light curve constructed in blue optical with the wavelength ranges shown. Okay. 200 nanometer, 200 angstrom bins sizes, and with a few hundred ppm precision. We then measure the transit depth to each wavelength, which gives us a transmission spectrum. So I'm looking at WASP-4b, a hot Jupiter of 1700 Kelvin, and so here is an atmospheric model of what we expect to see for that kind of planet. So we expect the dominant opacity sources to be from atomic sodium and potassium. And we then construct the transmission spectrum from one transit observation in the blue and two in the red. And in the red, transits were taken 1 year apart, but the transit depths agree within 1 sigma, so that's a good indication that the method is reliable. So you can see that there's a big difference between the model and the measured transmission spectrum, but the spectrum is well fit by a wavelength to the -4 slope, which is, we interpret as being from radio scattering in the atmosphere high up, so that you can't see deeper into the atmosphere, where you would expect to see the pressure fall in line with the sodium feature. So that was our first result. Before I show you some more results, I just want to briefly outline a couple of the challenges that we faced with this survey program. So, as I said, we need precisions of 100 ppm in 10 nanometer bins, which is to measure atmospheric features at the 3 sigma level. And the first problem that we found was that the instruments are at the Cassegrain focus, and so there's a lot of movement during our 5 to 6 hour observation. And we find that the spectra shift on the detector, which means that the wavelength distribution per pixel changes in time. So here's an extracted spectrum from one frame of our target WASP-4b in the top, and in the bottom I'm zooming in on the sodium feature, which is important in the exoplanet atmosphere. And so I'm plotting in black the first exposure of the time series, and in red, yes, you can see that in red is the last exposure of the time series. And you can see that the line center shifts by 2 pixels. And this is important when we want to characterize sodium in the atmosphere. We want to measure the transit depth in the sodium compared to the transit depth in the continuum. So it's important to sample the same wavelength in time. We also investigated the effect of spectral shifting on the broadband transmission spectrum. So we measured the shifting in lines as a function of time and injected these measured shifts into simulated data with a known transit depth. And then we fitted for the transit depth at each wavelength. So I'm showing now in the bottom part of the feature is the measured transit depth at each wavelength for an input transit depth with a constant wavelength as a function of wavelength, which would be like a flat transmission spectrum. So that's shown with the red line. So what we find is that the transit depth deviates more in the blue for GMOS from the input radius than it does at other wavelengths. So that means that we would infer scattering signatures in this planet's atmosphere if the shifting is not corrected for. And many previous studies have not addressed this issue, and so this is a new procedure that we've implemented. And so we now have a pipeline that makes 2D maps of this shifting and allows us to correct for it. We also, another problem we faced was that we have significant fringing in the red part of the spectrum at the 10% amplitude. And the position of the spectrum changes with respect to the fringing over time. And you can see in the bottom panel, there's the black is the first exposure and the red is the last exposure. And you can see that the effects on the spectrum is different as a function of time. So this prevents us from getting precise spectrophotometry in this bin, and so we had to use a large photometric bin in the red part, which means we can't measure the abundance of potassium, but we do have an idea of the continuum level in the optical, which is important for linking to infrared data. So those are a couple of challenges. I just want to bring you one more result. This is Exo2b. It's a planet, it's another hot Jupiter, about 400 Kelvin cooler than WASP-4b. And here's the GMOS data compared to the model, which again is similar. So again, we're looking for sodium line weights and the abundances of sodium. So unlike before where we saw clouds, you see the clouds are ruled out in this atmosphere, and we detect the raw sodium line weights. So if I compare to the previous spectrum I showed you, that's WASP-4b on the left and Exo2b on the right, we can see one atmosphere is cloud-dominated and one that's cloud-free, with the hotter one being cloud-dominated. So right now, the first important result from the survey is that we see diversity in these atmospheres, and that's also a result that's been coming out of other surveys as well. We don't know yet how prevalent the clouds are across our sample, but so far the key result is that we have diversity we don't yet understand. And so with that in mind, I just want to summarize our findings of our survey so far. So we have a 9-planet survey that's now finished taking data. We have a high precision transmission spectra of 9 planets. we decided to observe a survey rather than individual planets to do a comparative study, which we'll do at the end of this year, and also to understand our noise sources better. So we worked in depth on 2 targets, but we have preliminary analysis of others. And the results show diversity in exoplanet atmospheres. So this was the first multi-object spectroscopy exoplanet atmosphere survey, and so there are important implications for other instruments or similar instruments on other facilities. And we've also learned several lessons. So we get good repeatability in multiple transits and multiple epochs. We found that we can get the precisions that we need and similar precisions to HST. And we found that queue scheduling is really important. So because that's allowed us to respond to changing priorities and conditions and get the transits that we need, the number of transits that we need. We've also had some problems with, mostly with instrument stability. And so that would be better addressed by a dedicated instrument. Even if it's on a smaller aperture telescope, our main sources of noise are systematic, and so that would be an improvement that we can make. And overall, we've proven that the technique is reliable. We do get repeatable results, and so I look forward to showing you more results very soon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We have time for a couple questions in the back. Yes.
Yeah, first of all, I second the dedicated instrument. I think it's about time after all these RV and imaging instruments we have to train the guys.
Yes.
Deserve one too, right?
We do. We really do one.
So the question is, your 10 arc seconds slit, is that an arbitrary number, or is that, you know, why not 9, why not 11, or it goes smaller, does your printing disappear, and so how do you get to 10 arc seconds?
We've actually tried a variety of different ones, and it does depend a bit on wavelength, and so your background limited into how wide you can make the slit as well. So we can make the slit usually 12 arc seconds in the blue and then about 10 in the red. So it becomes a trade-off between your background brightness and your slit losses.
You trade-off.
Yeah.
When you select your reference stars, is it important to select in similar spectral type and metallicity, so you remove all the lines essentially?
Yeah. So when we started this project, actually, we selected more than one reference star for each target because we have small slits about 30 arc seconds tall, and so we actually have more than one reference star for each. But we found that it was much better to use a single reference star for the same spectral type, and that improved our precision by over a factor of 2 by doing that. Yeah.
Sort of related, how important is it to have, you said they were aligned in wavelength on the detector.
Yeah.
How important is that as opposed to, I can imagine, you know, you didn't get it quite right, one just shifted just because of the slits.
Yeah, so it's important because we need to have the same range of coverage in both, so we don't want to lose, because essentially we can only use the part that's common to both anyway, so that would be truncating the wavelength. And also the shifting that we see is also, it's a function of where the stars are positioned on the detector, so how far apart they are in terms of the slit length. And so if they're offset slightly, I don't know, so ours are, we've always positioned them exactly the same way, but I would imagine that the shifting would get worse because it's a function of the detector's position, where the spectrum goes. So it would be less common between the two stars, and that's the worst effect that we have, because that affects our photometry and the light code.
Are there any more questions for Catherine? If not, then let's just